Good afternoon and welcome to the Heritage Foundation, to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We of course welcome those who join us on our Heritage website on all of these occasions, and would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off as we record the program. We will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference as well. And as you noticed, we do have copies of the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents, part of them at least, available in the lobby if you would like to purchase them. We, of course, this is part of a long-standing series that the publishers have done on various aspects of issues and interest to all of us, so we do encourage you to consider the book. Hosting our discussion and introducing our special guest will be Edwin Meese. Mr. Meese serves as the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow in Public Policy. He is also chairman of what is now the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies here at the Heritage Foundation. Please join me in welcoming the 75th Attorney General of the United States.
Thank you, John, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, particularly to introduce today's special guest and our speaker. Steve Hayward, I consider one of the best writers in the conservative movement. He has done some outstanding work. He is the senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, as you know, one of our companion institutions in Washington, D.C. here, with whom we do a lot of work, including recently co-sponsoring one of the presidential debates. He contributes to AEI's Energy and the Environment Outlook series. He's the author of a book entitled The Almanac of Environmental Trends. And he also, and I think one of his greatest works, has been two biographies, taking two phases of Ronald Reagan's political career, Ronald Reagan as governor of California and Ronald Reagan as president of the United States. He's also done biographies of Jimmy Carter and Winston Churchill. He has a distinguished background. He's active in a number of organizations, including the Pacific Research Institute and the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. He's had a great deal of experience as a Bradley Fellow, a Henry Salvatore Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, and also has done a number of things, including being a member of the California Citizens Compensation Commission and in various other academic pursuits. But today, for our purposes, he has done a particularly important thing, and that is looked at the modern presidency, that is from Woodrow Wilson through the presidency of Barack Obama. And one of the things he has done is looked at it from a different angle than most people writing about the presidents. He has looked at it from the standpoint of how have presidents done in regard, particularly in the modern era, in regard to what the Constitution and the founders had in mind for the presidency of the United States. And this distinguishes him from a number of the people who have done biographies of presidents or who have looked at presidents and evaluated them as he has in this particular book. It's not only an excellent book from the standpoint of its scholarship, but it's a very entertaining book. And I urge any of you who haven't purchased it before, you have that opportunity, as John pointed out, at the conclusion of this session here. So please join me in welcoming a good friend of Heritage and a very important part of the conservative movement, Steve Hayward.
Well, thank you, General Meese. General Meese tried to dissuade me from this, but it's likely impossible that I'll be able to get through this whole talk without recurring to my favorite theme, namely that Ed Meese was the greatest Attorney General ever, and we ought to even talk him into suiting up again for that job in the right circumstances, if we could. Well, it's been a delight to contribute the latest title in the Regnery line of iconoclastic politically incorrect guides, or PIGs for short. I really like that. It gives a whole new meaning to pigging out. But there's a couple of obvious threshold questions which General Meese has suggested in his introduction. What could be a politically incorrect perspective about the presidency, one of the great American institutions, right? How could that possibly end up politically incorrect? And then the second related question is, why start with Woodrow Wilson and not do all of the presidents from George Washington on? Well, glad you asked. There are two main axes of arguments that are closely connected and a couple of important ancillary parts to the argument. The first axis of the argument is that there really are two presidencies to think of. There's the presidency as the founders conceived it, and as most of our presidents practiced the institution throughout the 19th century, and then there's the modern presidency that I argue really begins decisively with Woodrow Wilson. You can make out that Theodore Roosevelt began some aspects of the modern presidency, and I comment on that briefly in the early introductory chapters, but it's Woodrow Wilson who really defines, I think, the modern presidency in its most important respects. And then the second axis of the book is that most, not all, but most of the leading books and treatments of the presidency, either the people who have served in the office or the institution itself or both, are actually defective in some profound and consequential ways. If you look at most of the modern textbooks that are used in colleges and universities, or the leading trade books that are crossover books between college books and for a general reading audience, if you look at most of the leading books, you'll see that most of them tend to treat the presidency and its occupants as though it were just another CEO position, albeit with a corporation, the US government, that's a little bit more complicated and Byzantine than IBM. Or Apple, I suppose. And the leading aspect of the presidency in most of the modern books is on the idea of leadership with a capital L, along with some personality traits of the president. So for example, just take two of the leading books that are still in print and widely used. James David Barber's book, The Presidential Character, a book that's gone through 4 editions since it was first published in 1972. It's a worthy book in a lot of ways. It's full of insight about different presidents and different character traits they had and how it was served them for ill or for good in office. And there's a lot to learn from the book. I don't want to say it's a bad book. It's not. It's a good book. But there is something missing. If you open to the index of the presidential character, you will not find a single index entry for Constitution or any of its correlates, like constitutional or constitutionalism. You know, sort of startling if you think about it for a moment. Or take Richard Neustadt's widely used book, Presidential Power and Modern Presidents. Again, another interesting book with lots of good material in it. It's also gone through many editions since it was first published back in the 60s. Also has no index entry for Constitution. And it's not just the index. If you go through the text of both of those books, you find no discussion of Article 2, really, beyond a couple of very instrumental things, but no substantive discussion of the constitutional dimensions of the president. And so you don't really get a discussion of statesmanship from these books. As I say, they make the presidency into another executive office, albeit one with fancier bells and whistles. I can go on down the list. Fred Greenstein's book, The Presidential Difference, Leadership Style from FDR to Clinton. Again, another good book. Greenstein's an interesting author. Also no discussion of the Constitution. And what this approach reflects is the modern, value-free, social science approach to political things that has largely ruined the academic discipline of political science and is well on its way to ruining the academic discipline of history as well. There are some exceptions to this. A couple I mentioned in the book, Mark Landy and Sid Milkis's book, Presidential Greatness, is a pretty good book on some of these questions. And I think the very best book, one that's now almost 20 years old, but still very much worth reading, is Forrest McDonald's book, The American Presidency and Intellectual History. It's probably the best book written by one of the great conservative scholars of modern times, Forrest McDonald. And then there's a curious outlier in all this, and that is, oddly enough, Arthur Schlesinger's famous book from the 70s, The Imperial Presidency. There he argues we need to bring the president back inside the Constitution. He talks about reinvigorating the separation of powers. But of course, Schlesinger, a liberal, was up to mischief. He wanted to buttress having been a champion of the imperial presidency before that, suddenly Schlesinger was shocked to learn that people like Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon could use the presidency in ways that he disapproved. And so he thought it's time to let Congress, which he thought would be dominated by Democrats forever, to become the preeminent branch again. So even there, a book that's sort of on the right track was on the right track for the wrong reasons and for wrong objects. Now, it's possible to judge presidents purely on an ideological scale. We have all these rankings and polls that come out from time to time from historians and academics, and they put presidents in categories of grade and near grade and average, below average, and so forth. You can do that, and mostly that reflects the policy preferences of the people who are responding to the surveys, for the most part. But I think there's a simpler and more direct method that allows you to abstract a little bit from policy choices and it is more useful and relevant. And that simple method is to take Article 2, the article that defines the office of President, and in particular, look at the oath of